All right, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you all today. And I will go through the climate change response framework because having seen the title, that might have been your first question, is what that is. I suspect some of you have heard of this generally, but especially from Jad. But secondarily, Jad asked me to talk about partnerships within the framework. And frankly, this is the first time I've ever been asked to give a whole presentation on partnerships within the framework. It was fun to think about this and put it together. Of course, I've been thinking about it generally for years now, but when you have to put things into actual words, like I heard just a minute ago, words really frame concepts, and now I'm going to be held accountable for what I'm saying about partnerships. So we'll see how that works out. Why think about partnerships in the climate change response framework? Right now, we have more than 150 organizations that are involved in this general community. They're not all involved in the same way or for the same reasons. And so, one of the questions is, why are they involved and what do they get out of it? So I'm going to go through first just a brief, very brief, for those of you who know me, overview of the climate change response framework. Right after I set context with our institute. The Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science is a chartered institute. You see that logo soup down there on the bottom. We are primarily funded and we are led by the U.S. Forest Service. But we have a lot of organizational members, universities, conservation organizations, and the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission that support us in various ways. And they have often different views of how to work on the landscape, what appropriate forest management may be, and how to really even work with climate change. But what they agree upon is that an organization is needed to take the often academic discussion of climate and climate change and translate that into practical information and usable adaptation resources, and then work with organizations that work on the land to apply that information and those resources. And so that's what our organization does. As a fundamental aspect of our success, when people that we are working with are successful and meeting their goals, that's when we are successful. Okay. One thing to think about is where we primarily work, which is in these northern 20 states in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. We do work nationally to some degree, but our focus is definitely on these 20 states. If you think about the forest ownership in this region, it is very diverse and amongst the most diverse in the country. When you think about the partner organizations within NIACS, they themselves are very diverse. And all of this really not just incentivizes us, but forces us to think about how to really embrace this diversity and work with it as an opportunity rather than something to essentially suffer through. Because when you think about this diversity, both in ecosystems and ownership, really what that translates into are huge diversity in values. And when you look at forest management is always based in values. And when you think about climate-informed decisions, those themselves, again, are based in values. And so how do we accommodate the diversity of ecosystems, the diversity of values that underlie the management of those forest ecosystems? The way that we went about doing this is to create what eventually we called the Climate Change Response Framework. It is a structured approach to climate adaptation that involves a good deal of process. It works a little differently on different scales. Fundamentally, it is centered around partnerships, and of course I'll get to that. But I'll cover also a bit about a vulnerability assessment we do to provide information as a basis for adaptation, resources that help people essentially apply that information in ways that are practical and useful for them, and then ultimately getting to, and everything moves toward this, getting things done on the land. And we then help people create adaptation demonstrations, which are demonstrations of them really trying to reach their objectives and meet their goals on the land in a climate-informed manner. So the forest ecosystem vulnerability assessments that we do, I think at this point, we do them on an eco-regional basis. You can see the different shades of color there on the map that represent different assessments areas that we've covered. I think we've done about 8 of these at this point. There are probably a couple hundred different authors that have taken part in these. We examine a range of future climates. We use models that inform the process but do not make decisions about vulnerability. The decisions are made in a transparent way by panels of ecologists, scientists, modelers, and land managers. One thing that is critical about this is that in these assessments, we do not make recommendations. When you think about partnerships, people are coming into this partnership. I mentioned, the couple hundred authors that we have on these things. Some have as many as 45 authors in one assessment. They're entering this process for different reasons, with different stakes and incentives. And so they ultimately may take the information produced by this process and use it in different ways. And so really, when you consider that a vulnerability assessment may ultimately include recommendations, some of the participants might not agree with the recommendations, even if they agree with the information. What's more is that in the broader public that we want to use this information to help inform their decisions, they may be doubtful of the information if they don't agree with the recommendation, if that recommendation does not align with their values in the landscape and how to manage forests. And so, partnership at this level often involves research agencies at the federal and state level. It involves academics at universities. It involves ologists, the biologists, the ecologists, and other resource specialists of that nature, working at both an applied and on a scientific level to produce information that is useful for forest managers. And then you have forest adaptation resources. We produced the 2nd edition recently of the climate change tools and approaches for land managers. This includes menus of strategies and approaches, adaptation strategies and approaches. Notably, they're menus. And if you think about what I just said, they are not guides to tell people what to do, but menus of adaptation actions that help people identify what their intent is. And so they may have an action on the landscape and they link that action to a broader strategy for adaptation that shows intent of how they want to adapt their management activities or their ecosystem in order to meet their objectives upon the landscape. It's a menu because, like a menu in a restaurant, you don't necessarily choose everything on the menu. That would be really impressive and maybe a little disturbing. Instead, you might choose what looks good to you. You might actually not like some things on the menu, and I hear about this often. But it's the whole menu isn't necessarily for you, and that's all right. The menu is linked to an adaptation workbook. This is an actual workbook. It's a process to help people organize their thinking. It's grounded in their objectives on the landscape. It certainly integrates vulnerability information like the information that we produce and others produce. But the manager ultimately makes decisions about what's vulnerable on their land, and they do it explicitly within this workbook process. They reconsider their objectives and they think about how they might alter their objectives or alter their actions or alter their ecosystem to better meet their objectives. And essentially those alterations, or if they decide really that what they're doing is good, that's all that adaptation really is. But we help people to be explicit and again, to show their intentionality by identifying what the broader adaptation strategy they're approaching looks like. So what we do is we bring groups through this process, and at this point we have more than 200 adaptation demonstrations. And so These are on all different kinds of ownerships, and they are real-world projects. So this isn't a theoretical exercise. These are projects that are happening on the ground in which people have gone through, all of them have gone through this same process and then made climate-informed decisions about how they're going to implement their projects on the ground in a manner that helps meet their objectives or helps reach their objectives. And so one of the things that we have a goal of doing in this process then is helping organizations not only to meet their own goals, but to understand the goals of others, to learn how others are coping with what they consider to be climate threats in ways that mitigate those threats and help them reach their objectives more effectively. And in some cases, that's a steep learning curve from one organization to the next. And just as people often don't agree with forestry as it's done now between organizations, it takes a little bit of tolerance to think about how they're going to deal with adaptation. But equally with adaptation in modern forestry, there's a huge diversity of approaches out there, and there's not one way to do things. Likewise, in adaptation, there is not a single silver bullet. And what's more is that given the rapid rate of climate change and the way that it's beginning to affect forests, the greater diversity of approach, the greater diversity of thinking, and then the faster that we can share information, the more likely we are to cope with these issues in a really productive manner with the least waste of time and the least degradation of resources. One of the things that we do then is share information from our partners on the internet so that people can see the diverse lands, objectives. They can see the differences between organizations, both in their objectives and in the way that they manage for those objectives. But they can also see how there are shared perspectives. At this point, we have about 130 of these online. So when you think about partnership on this level, really the organizations, they're just trying to get their work done. We're bringing a process that helps them get that work done in a more climate-informed manner so they can walk forward into that range of plausible futures with their eyes wide open, making decisions with clear intentionality. Share their thoughts and their objectives and their approaches with others so that others might learn. So certainly they're in it for their own reasons, but they also allow us to share some of those reasons, which helps others learn. So to this partnership model bit, I struggled a bit with this, trying to come up with something that would make me sound maybe more intelligent than I actually am. Ultimately, I just came back to the stone soup approach and figured maybe just being as clear as I could would be better than just sounding impressive. So really, the stone soup approach is the way that we take on this issue, because it is a massive issue, and we're a small institute, and there's only so much we can do. But I would say we have an outsized effect because we are so inclusive of the perspectives and the willingness to contribute of other organizations. I want to provide a juxtaposition with this sort of partnership model of stone soup, which I think we're all aware of. I won't recount the whole fable right now, with this idea of the tragedy of the commons. And so the tragedy here, of course, is not just the degradation of resources, but that people are actually acting in a logical manner in pursuit of their self-interest. But that everybody doing that at once really creates a lose-lose situation in which those resources are degraded. And that's the real tragedy, is that they're acting rationally, but not for the greater good. And so when you come back to this idea of the stone soup, people are still acting in self-interest here. It includes very much that concept of acting in self-interest and acting rationally, but ultimately for the greater good. And so, what is it that it takes to get there? I would say that it really requires a neutral convener, and that is perhaps the fundamental difference between the rational actors in the tragedy of the commons and the rational actors in that stone soup approach, is that in the stone soup approach you have a neutral convener. Now, in the fable, of course, there's a bit of trickery involved. I would say that, you know, my use of this analogy fails a bit there, because we really emphasize transparency and the trust of that neutral convener, especially with a topic as controversial as climate change tends to be. That trust is really essential. And one critical way of building that trust is for the convener, and this is something we swear by, to always remember that the discussion, the project, the product, whatever we are doing in the moment with one of the partners is not about us. It's not about the convener. It is about the project. It is about the partner. It is about the larger discussion that we're having. That means that, again, we don't bring our biases and recommendations to that discussion. At the core, what we're doing is convening something that is larger and more important than us. So this concept of the convener is central to the idea of a stone soup approach. And it's where I think when you don't have something like that, that again, the rational actors create the tragedy by falling into the tragedy of the commons. Secondarily, it really relies then on self-interest. If it requires a neutral convener, this entire process is still based on self-interest. We don't expect that everybody who engages with us in partnership at the different levels, whether it's creating a vulnerability assessment, whether it is participating in creating resources to help people apply information, or whether they're just getting their own jobs done but allowing us to call it a demonstration. They're not all getting into this for the same reasons. They don't necessarily have aligned interests. Some of them may be working towards the greater good as they see it, which may be different than how we see it. Some of them may be doing this purely for self-interest, and that's just fine. We don't need everybody to be doing things for the same reasons or working in lockstep. Further, it's on us as the conveners to show them that their self-interest will be rewarded. We had a much harder time when we were first starting because we didn't have products to show them. They didn't know what they were getting into and what they were essentially investing in. Now that we have a track record, as well as a reputation and trust as a neutral convener, organizations and people are much more willing to join us in these endeavors and to join others in joining us in these endeavors. And so again, that is fully in their self-interest, and we don't really expect anything else. We don't expect them to join us through altruism. That's certainly nice if it happens, but what we do expect is for them to pursue their self-interest. And to the extent that we're listening to them, we help them do that. So that listening bit is really about good faith as well. So while this process requires a neutral convener, it relies effectively on self-interest. It actually thrives then on good faith, and that is good faith by the convener, and in which we listen, we make sure that what we create is useful, and that's because we're listening, and then ultimately we follow through to get it done. And this gets back to that self-interest and mutual investment that people are engaging in. They trust us to get it done, and we've shown them that we do. They trust us to make it useful, and we listen to them and include them in the process to ensure that it will get useful. All of that is based upon good faith. You can get it done without the good faith, but it won't be as good fundamentally. And then finally, there's that idea, again, of learning by doing and learning together. And so when we hold workshops in which we bring as many as 10 organizations into the same workshop to work through this adaptation planning process, they're sharing information with each other. They're sharing their perspectives, and they don't have to agree with each other, and they don't always do so. But they're all in there learning from each other actively, and that's an act of good faith, again. And so that is fundamental to the process. And frankly, coming together like that in these workshops and hearing from other organizations, and we have done dozens of these workshops, that is always the highest rated portion of these workshops, is the people, organizations hear from other organizations. So you need a neutral convener. It relies on self-interest. The neutral convener offsets that bit of falling into the, sorry, I'm not supposed to use the word offset. I promise I didn't use it in a carbon sense. Neutral convener stops you from dropping into the tragedy of the commons, but self-interest is still necessary for people to be willing to invest any effort into this, even if it's not necessarily for the greater good. But then the good faith is really what makes this thrive, I think. So I'll just finish by saying that ultimately, when we're most successful in the work that we do and in the partnerships that we engage in at all of these different levels that we engage in them with, whether it's with a researcher or a practitioner, it's when we remember that it is really not about climate. We're a climate group, but what we do is not about climate. What we do is about people and then the places that they work in. And their decisions are going to be about their values and their places, not about climate. When we remember that, it shapes everything we do differently and we're more successful. Thank you.